Today we'll be talking about both the Kohler Wellworth and Highline Ingenium toilets, which started around 1997, at least for the Ingenium type flush. These are often regarded as good toilets by many people, but has it always been like that? I argue not, because starting in the late 1990s, these had kind of a rocky start, in some ways or another. But let's take a look at them. The design is very standard, but it definitely has a unique look to the bowl, at least, standing out a little bit more. Trapway is nothing really to write home about, but it definitely looks pretty passable for what it is. It definitely could be a lot worse, like the Wellworth Lite. We do not talk about that. Trapway opening is this trapezoid-like shape, almost. These are mostly consistent, though around the 2000s, some versions of the Wellworth do have some kind of weird trapways that look more boxy than more rough, like this one, which is interesting. Inside the tank is pretty standard. As you can see, there is a fluid master fill valve. I think they do differ per year, but this one is an early one. I do not know if this is original or not, but I do tend to notice they have fluid master fill valves in them. You also have a normal flapper, which does complete the flush. The later versions, mostly ones from the late 2000s, do have water-saving flappers, which can affect their flushes. So if you have one of those, I'd advise you to either adjust it some way or just replace it. It's for the better. But inside the tank, not much to really write home about. It's pretty standard. Let's have a look at a flush. For a 1.6 gallon toilet, it actually does not have a bad flush at all. Now, one of the great things about this toilet is the performance. These do have pretty strong performances most of the time. Not really the late 1990s version, though. The reason being is probably because of the more rough around the edges kind of design, and it didn't really perfect it until like the early 2000s. I have noticed that they do clog a little bit more compared to the later versions from the 2000s. But this is not really a great sign for that. I wouldn't say it's terrible though, because I've actually put up with one of these for a year and I've had zero problems. Even though someone did clog it at one point, but that's the only clog I've ever seen from an Ingenium like this from any year, which is kind of impressive to think about, but still something to consider. Let's have a look at bowl rinse. Honestly, not too bad. You can see it does cover some of the area. I think the back might struggle a little bit more compared to most, but honestly, the bowl rinse is not bad at all. I'll take one more view from here. Another good thing about these toilets are the pulls and siphons. As you saw, the flush is pretty long, and the siphon is also pretty long too. And as you saw, it kind of dedicates most of its time to pulling stuff down and siphoning out for pretty long. Most Ingeniums do this. I think the only times it would have problems pulling things down is when it has a short flush, which is more prone to the late 2000s version due to the water-saving flapper. But besides that, there's generally ways to work around it by holding down the handle or just replacing the flapper, so it's not too much of an issue with these toilets. And that is the Kohler Wellworth and Highline Ingenium toilets. Generally pretty good toilets, but the rocky start does kind of make that a little bit more apparent during the earlier versions. I definitely think this is definitely one of the better 1.6 gallon toilets to ever get out of this era, along with a few others, but let's grade them. The overall design of the Ingenium Wellworth and Highline is nothing really to write home about. It's pretty standard. It's very similar to that of a 3.5 version, but with its own bit of differences. That being said though, it doesn't really look dated in any restroom, honestly. It can fit in right into a modern restroom pretty well, and I give it a 6. The original parts, for the most part, are perfectly fine. They're fairly functional and they work pretty well. I will note on later versions like the late 2000s, they tend to have water-saving flappers, which can be a hindrance. But besides that, these really don't have any parts with major issues. So I'll give it a 7. The quality control overall is surprisingly pretty good, which is very shocking for a 1.6 gallon toilet, as many of them don't have great quality control aspects. These actually function fairly well, they flush properly, and also has a front-fed siphon jet to also assist the flush. These things function fairly well, but sometimes these toilets tend to have kind of weaker flushes. Thankfully, this is a rare problem and I've only seen it one time, but it's still something to consider. Besides that, the quality control is pretty good and I give it an 8. The trapway is perfectly fine. There's nothing really to write home about it. It's a pretty standard 2-inch trapway. It works fairly well. It's nothing jagged or ridiculous looking. It's pretty standard, but it works perfectly well, and I'll give it a 7. The flush is not bad at all. This actually has somewhat of a swirly flush, but for most of the flush it actually pulls things down a lot. Has a pretty long siphon and a pretty long pull duration. We'll get to that in a second, but the flush is not bad. But besides that, it's not too exciting, but it does work perfectly well. It gets a 7. The pull and siphon is great, honestly. These things have pretty long pull durations, and the siphon's also pretty long too, guaranteeing that most things will get down. I don't think I've ever really seen any of these struggle or shred on anything, which is kind of surprising. Keep in mind, this is the 1.6 gallon period, and some toilets do have issues getting things down properly. But besides that, these actually have great pulls, and I've given an 8. For the most part, the performances are pretty good too. These rarely clog if anything, but I do have to bring up a point. The earlier versions tend to not perform the greatest. It's not like they perform badly or anything, but they do have a tendency to have some issues. Granted, I've put up with one from 1997 and I've had no problems with it, but that same toilet I put up with was clogged by another individual. So I guess it really depends on user's choice or how you're treating the toilet, I guess. The late 90s versions tend to not perform the greatest. It's only really until like the 2000s when the performance would be pretty much perfected and to be pretty good. If it wasn't for that factoid, I would have given it an 8, but I'll have to settle on a 7. The Bowens also is not bad. It actually covers most of the area. I think maybe the only times I'll have Bowens issues is on like the slight back rim like any other toilet. But besides that, this thing actually rinses very well and I have to give it a 7. These toilets are known to last for a pretty good long time. There's still plenty of these I see to this very day. And I don't really ever recall one being replaced. Maybe there was probably one or two every now and then I just don't know about. But these things can last a long time. Yes, even the late 90s version, which I mentioned was kind of a rocky start for the Ingeniums in general. But besides that, these things can last a very good long time and have a strong foothold in really anywhere. Sometimes even in public places, which is kind of crazy to think about. I give it an 8. Now it's time to talk about the overall value of these. These things are really good. They're not amazing per se, but they're really good. For a 1.6 gallon toilet, I was kind of blown away of how well this thing works. It flushes well, it performs well, it pulls really well, and honestly it looks nice in any bathroom. You can put this in a modern bathroom and most people won't even bat an eye. This is a pretty good toilet that I wish Kohler didn't discontinue for their awful Class 5 and Class 6 toilets, which are exponentially worse than the Ingeniums. Granted, not every Ingenium is a winner. We'll kind of touch bases on those that just don't work well in later videos, but the Wellworth and Highline Ingeniums, the regular ones per se, work very well. Honestly, I really don't have anything to complain about. Granted, some of the earlier ones did have some slight issues, but most of the time it's kind of a rare thing to happen, from what I've seen at least. This is definitely a toilet I would not mind installing anywhere. I just wish they didn't discontinue for those awful Class 5 and 6 toilets. That was Kohler's mistake right there. But anyway, I'm giving the value an 8. And the final score of the Kohler Wellworth and Highline Ingenium toilets is a 73 out of 100. This is probably one of the rare examples where 1.6 gallons was used at its fullest potential. These are really good toilets. Granted, they're not amazing per se, but they just work very well. Very efficient, very effective at doing its job, and probably wouldn't give you many problems. Even despite its rocky start in the late 90s, it would grow to be probably one of Kohler's best modern toilets. Again, Kohler made a huge mistake discontinuing these.